Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. So this is the Obermann Conversation, Imagining Community in 2030. My name is Lauren Cox, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Obermann Center. And just to give you a little brief overview of the Obermann Center supports the research work of the University of Iowa faculty and students. The Obermann Conversation series pairs University of Iowa faculty with thought leaders in the community. Learning from each other and delighting in the combined knowledge of academics and practitioners are the goals of this program. The structure of today's event will be that the panelists will answer some questions that I ask, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Please hold your questions until then. And then also, if you're interested in sticking around and chatting after the event, we have some great community groups in the back that are tabling if you're interested in learning about volunteer opportunities. We have the Coralville Community Food Pantry, the United Way, and the Community Foundation of Johnson County in the back. So thank you, all three organizations, for coming here today. And now I would like for our fabulous panel to introduce themselves. And so if you want to just go down the line and say your name and how you're connected to this topic.
I'll start. So my name is Katie Gerlach. I'm the director of Better Together 2030, so I get to claim that number at least for this panel. Better Together 2030 is part of the Community Development Corporation Better Together, and it's funded by community and economic development partners you see on the plan here. And we embarked on a 2030 visioning process after the pandemic, and so it's really been great to work with these three as part of a 2030 visioning. I'll kind of take a little bit and step back and say that Project Better Together started in 2020 as a way for the region to respond to the collective impacts of COVID-19 and other events of 2020, and we built on that trust and then took it to the first ever regional strategic plan. So that's my connection to 2030. It's a lofty goal to help execute on the strategic plan that we've adopted together towards a shared future. But 2030 felt like a short time that we could really make some achievable impacts, but also that we weren't looking at maybe 2040 and really not getting people invested in the work.
My name is Paola Jaramillo Guajera. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I currently serve as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator for Johnson County out of the Board of Supervisors office. Connected to Better Together 2030, I actually sat in on their big sort, which was exciting because my career actually started with the organization in the back corner of the room, but served as the Programs and Communications coordinator. Ooh, I don't even remember what I used to do there anymore. For the Coralville Community Food Pantry, where I kind of fell in love and really found my passion for community engagement, community organizing, and nonprofit work, and so was excited to kind of bring that background to the government level and work on that staff that does really, really collaborative, innovative work, and so excited to be here and talk about something that I absolutely love, which is this community and the way nonprofit and the university and kind of all of those things play a role in making this a great place to work and to live and to play.
I'm Rachel Young. I'm an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And since the fall, I've also been the faculty fellow in the Office of Community Engagement. So my interest is in sustainable and mutually beneficial partnerships between university students, faculty and staff, and community partners and community organizations. I've worked to develop several programs that help our students' learning or our faculty's research benefit community partners, including a long-term project with nonprofits primarily in Coralville, including the food pantry. And am getting really excited now in my work with the Office of Engagement to think about the incentive structure for faculty around community engagement and how our reward systems do or don't reflect the values that we say we have for engagement.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Benson. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Community Engagement. Rachel told you just a little bit about our work. We really try to serve as a bridge between campus and community. Our goal is to connect our faculty, our staff, our students with community partners, not just here, but really across the state and beyond. We really believe that community engagement is an important way in which we as an institution show our public value. And we also think that we're an important partner and that all of you are important partners in imagining what our future might look like. And that's why we're so happy to be a part of the Better Together 2030 process. So happy to be here today and look forward to this conversation.
All right, thank you all. So before we begin, I was hoping that Nick and Katie could maybe give us a brief overview of the Better Together 2030 and kind of how we got to where we are right now.
Sure, you want me to start?
Sure.
So I think this is really illustrative of all the people that have been doing work in the community and economic development space before 2020. And really what happened was they found that a lot of the messaging they were delivering to community members was the same. And so rather than continue to repeat the same message, they got together and they formed what they called Project Better Together. So every Friday, community leaders from across these different organizations got together for a phone call, and they updated each other on what's happening in our community, what are some challenges that we need to respond to, and how can we get there together. So from that, you'll have seen things like Shop Local, Holding Our Own campaign, adopting a healthcare worker. You probably saw those signs out. And what they did then was we established a really baseline level of trust that hadn't existed before. Everyone had been working in silos and not really collaborating as much as they could. And so they wanted to build on the trust that was established from those collaborations. And they hired a futurist, which is a real job. And you can be a futurist and help communities come up with their vision for the future. But I think what's important for our vision is that at the very first session we met and decided that we were not going to have a shared vision for the future. Because one of our leaders, Angie Jordan, said, I need everyone to understand that I have a vision, you have a vision, but we're never going to have the same vision because our backgrounds are so different. What we want from the world might be different, but what I can promise and commit to you is that I will share a future with you. So rather than come up with a shared vision, we agreed that as together, we were going to come up with strategies for a shared future. And so that's what we committed to as a team. And so we've all brought those to the guiding principles that we established, which are representative leadership, collaboration, and a growth mindset. And then the 5 pillars that we established as leading the efforts. Anything else, Nick?
You know, I think what I would just say too is that the university was really pleased to be a part of this process. Obviously, as a major institution in Johnson County, it's so valuable for us to be a part of, like Katie said, not just a shared visioning process, but a shared future. And thinking about, obviously, as a higher education institution, we have 30,000 potentially future leaders in our community. And so thinking about what that world looks like for them was really important for us and as an institution, and it's great to be a part of this conversation in that way. So,
the other part about the university is that we named, Barbara Wilson was one of the
Yes.
tri-chairs that led this process, and it was her first act that she took as president. So she led it with Kate Moreland from ICAD, Angie Jordan, and herself, and she actually named the plan. She didn't know it, but what she said was, we need you, you need us, we are all in. And so we thought, what better way to hold the university accountable to joining this shared future, but to name the plan the All-In Vision.
So with that, I was wondering if you all could talk about, and maybe Rachel and Nick are going to speak to this more, is how can the University of Iowa contribute to building a better future for all? How can the UI rethink its position in the community?
yeah, well, you know, I mean, I think that that's one of the exciting things about Better Together 2030 is it gives all of us a chance to come together to the table to not just have one actor, like the University of Iowa, think about what 2030 is going to look like, but have all of us sit around a table and say, what are your goals and objectives? What are our goals and objectives? And how do we work together, even if those might be different, right? And so one of the things that I think we're trying to do at the University of Iowa is really involve our faculty and staff in those conversations, because that's really who we are as an institution. We are our people, we are our faculty, we are our staff, we are our students. And so one of the things we're really trying to do, and this has been a great partnership with Katie, but with really everybody that's a part of this shared planning process, is embedding our students and our faculty in a whole host of projects that are out across the community. Sometimes it's happening through courses, sometimes it's happening through research projects, but that's one of the best ways for us as an institution to lean into this idea that if we're going to work together, it has to be in a collective manner. We all have to be at the table together. Now, we have a lot of work to do as an institution. And historically, higher education institutions, it really wasn't until the 80s and 90s that we really started to lean into community engagement. But we have processes and procedures that are in place. So Rachel was mentioning this issue of promotion and tenure for our faculty. We don't always reward our faculty for doing this kind of community engaged work. So that's something that Rachel and I are working on right now. But I think one of the great things about a collective impact process, something that's great about the Better Together 2030 process, is that it allows us all to sort of move forward together. So it's not just one of us taking a step, it's all of us taking a step together. And that, honestly, I think oftentimes we don't recognize the importance of that, that even as the largest actor in the state of Iowa, the University of Iowa is the largest organization in the state of Iowa. Even as the largest organization in the state of Iowa, we can't move our community forward unless if all of us are doing it together. And so that really speaks to the importance of sort of this collective impact process. I don't know, Rachel, if you want to speak at all to the.
Yeah, no, I would just maybe add that, I mean, when we were kind of having our pre-talk about this conversation, I can't remember who said it, but I mean, they say, you know, the University has a massive footprint. And that's like a visual I keep having of like, we have a massive footprint, you know, and that's a lot of space taken up, a lot of big shadow and a lot of pressure. And I think that's something that we have to have both a lot of real awareness of and like a lot of humility about that I think we could do much better with. I think just being in the community doesn't mean that we are a community partner. And I think sometimes that the distinction between being present here and having a massive footprint and how are we creating like what collective impact would require, like shared agenda, shared measurement, shared assessment. What does success mean? You know, I mean, those types of shared outcomes or processes that like continuous conversation is needed to develop, and that trust and humility again is needed to develop. Like that, I think is where, you know, where we need to be putting more of our effort.
I really like the image that Nick just drew of taking a step forward together, because what I think is so imperative about that is that it might take some organizations way more than one step to make that big step forward. And I think in our community in particular, we have a nonprofit sector that is very strong, tends to be very collaborative, and their steps are often much larger than some of the other players. Yeah. And what happens when it is such a massive footprint and suddenly all those smaller steps or all those other steps get engulfed? You miss out on them, you lose them, and a lot of the time when the step that is taken leads in a direction that is opposite from where the rest of the group is going, it ends up causing a lot of chaos, and it ends up putting, I would say, like a lot of our social service providers or a lot of our nonprofits having to build this giant bridge to try to wage that space that has now been built. And so what is also important about having this kind of more collaborative approach is this idea that my mom, when I was younger, always used to have this story of like, we can't be pulling in different directions because if, you know, we're two farm animals and we're pulling in the opposite direction, we're never going to get anywhere. So it's this idea of like, if we can all collaboratively move towards that direction, all of those investments that are done by community, by our nonprofits, by government, they're going to have a much larger impact rather than trying to fill this void that kind of has been created in the fact that we were all moving away in opposite directions.
Okay, thanks. Powell, actually, I was wondering if you could also talk about, we in our pre-meeting talked about, you know, how people experience space and place and how that's also important to this initiative, and you said some really great words about it, so I was wondering if you could speak to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will be quite honest, I'm homegrown from Iowa City, was born here, was not raised here technically, well, part of my childhood, but went to Weber and Northwest and West, and then I'm an Iowa grad. So I've lived in this space in a lot of different ways, and I think if I remember the conversation was like, how does our community build, first of all, a space for this group of people, of students really, that are coming and going from different places of the world, who have different, lived experiences, all those things. And at the same time, how do we create space for the community that is here, that has always been here, that will continue to be here over time? And so I can't remember exactly what I said, but I think something that is really important, and I think a lot to the work that Nick and Rachel do and other professors do when they do collaborative work, like service learning projects with community organizations, is they are really teaching students to walk into a place and understand what that space actually means for the community that is here. So it is walking into those communities and not just saying, hey, I'm here to do my 5 hours of volunteering because I'm taking this one class and I have to write a report, but it's a true understanding of you are now walking into this community space that has lived experiences, that community has built into some place that they feel safe, that they feel heard, that they feel confident in, and they're willing to understand that. And I would say not necessarily put a spotlight on it, but also get behind and push where that community is trying to go. And so I think something that's really interesting about our community is how does our lived space really work? Because it is very shared and it is very intertwined. And so how do we teach students, and I think community members as a whole, to step into spaces of really communities that have often been left behind, that have been ignored, that have been put into situations where the system has worked against them, and not continue to feed into this white saviorship that we often tend to see when it comes to nonprofit work, but really help them understand that they're walking into these lived spaces and that they do have an opportunity to support, but that support has to come from that community, from a true understanding of what that community wants and what that community needs. And so that what they might be asking you to do might be completely different than what you walked into that space thinking you were going to do. And I think being able to teach students that at such young levels, because honestly, I'm 30 and I'm trying to figure my life out, okay? Aren't we all? But being able to teach that to students at these really young ages, where they're really building and understanding the world around them, as they move away from our space, I think they continue to do that space and placemaking in their new spaces.
I would say, too, just to highlight Katie's work with Better Together 2030, I think this is a great example of recognizing the importance of having different voices around the table when we're having planning conversations and when we're identifying what are our priorities. I think a good example of this is the inclusive economic development work. And economic development has traditionally been conversations in very particular ways. And I think, I don't want to speak for you, Katie, and I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I think that that's a good example of making sure the right voices and the different voices are in the room when we're having these conversations.
I think the partners in our community, and I see a lot of you around the room today, have all agreed to do things differently as a part of this, and that's been really exciting. And thinking about the Inclusive Economic Development Plan, which I'd recommend all of you to read that as well, in addition to the All-in Vision Plan if you need some light reading. But the Inclusive Economic Development Plan highlights where we've come from as a community and those greatest needs of the, they call them underestimated business owners, because underrepresented and minority wasn't really the right definition. What they found was that they were ready to go, they just needed something. And so that's why they called them underestimated in the plan. And I think that was really fitting. Ellie, would you grab the door real quick? What you'll see with the Inclusive Economic Development Plan is that it highlights both external resources that we need to realign as community partners, but that also internal work that we all need to do in anti-racism and really examining how we perceive rules and systems of organization and how we organize ourselves, and maybe how those things might be rooted in systems of white supremacy, and how are we really we're not going to try to push people into a system that doesn't even work for us, let alone try to push people that maybe have been underestimated into a system that we know is going to fail them because the rules themselves were set up that way. And so I think if you look at the plan, you'll see that there's work for each of us to do as community members as well. Because, and I say this all the time, so Nick's probably so sick of this. Nick's on the board of Better Together, so he hears this presentation a lot, but I think this community works for many of us in this room. I know it works for my family and I. That's why we picked it. That's why we live here, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so the big part of this work is looking at how we make a community that works for those people that maybe haven't traditionally been at those tables that could inform these plans.
And I think highlighting those knowledges is super important. A lot of the time, I think in academic spaces, it tends to be brought in like, this is how you do the thing, right? Like, we have research that tells you that this is how you do the thing. But the people that have lived in those spaces and places and those that it hasn't worked for, they're like, nah, I have my own knowledge. I've built up my knowledge, and that's important. And they're knowledgeable in those spaces, and that knowledge is important. And I think that highlights a great opportunity that the university has to make sure that that footprint is reflective of those knowledges and doesn't necessarily come in and say, well, this is how we've done it for 100 years. And I think to the Better Together point too, it's really maximizing the opportunities for those knowledges to become community knowledge and be used as foundation to build on, which I think is huge.
And maybe not, and seeing it as part of the plan, which also is a study. So it really looked at the system we have. The other thing it highlighted was that there are entire economies already operating that we may not even be aware of, that we're not a part of. And so how do we actually just create an ecosystem where those economies can also thrive with the traditional economies that we're used to operating in, and make a whole ecosystem that lifts everybody up rather than trying to shove people into a pigeonhole.
I was also wondering if anyone wanted to speak to how to include rural perspectives in this placemaking.
I brought a guest for that.
Okay.
So I brought along Sarah Thompson. Can you raise your hand, Sarah? Sarah's the Director of Rural Development for Greater Iowa City, Inc., and she brings an incredible perspective of rural development work. And we say rural development, you think farms and things like that. But what Sarah's really skilled at is main streets and community development projects that give unique identities to towns and make them feel authentic. And what makes a town, Sarah is going to help that town figure it out and make it into a plan and then action. So hopefully after this presentation you can speak with Sarah, but she's working really hard with communities in Lone Tree, Swisher, all around the community to really make this plan and what they want to do active.
I would say too, just that Sarah and Katie and everybody is a great partner for our students. I think we oftentimes think of our students as working only within the boundaries of Iowa City, right? Or maybe Coralville or maybe North Liberty. But the truth is some of the richest experiences that our students have are in our rural communities, because that gives them the opportunity to really touch the big issues that are impacting communities in a way that might be a smaller drop if it was in, for example, Iowa City. And so I think, we see a lot of opportunity for our students. The other thing is that it's good for our students to recognize that there are opportunities in rural Iowa, and there are opportunities to do really great work. And the fact is that if we want to continue to work on our state, it's not just going to be in Iowa City. It's not just going to be in Coralville. It's going to have to be in our rural communities as well. And so giving our students at the University of Iowa, as well as our faculty, and our faculty are doing some great research in rural communities as well, but it's so critical for us to have partners like Sarah and like others who are doing work in rural communities to really show our students and our faculty the opportunities that are out there. And so we're very grateful for that.
Sarah and I were just talking today and with our team that Iowa State has a distinct advantage over the University of Iowa because they have extension offices. Yeah. And the University of Iowa doesn't have that same kind of immediate footprint, to use that word, in every county. So part of this partnership between Sarah and the Office of Community Engagement, at least here in Johnson County, allows that extension kind of feel to it.
I just briefly add that in the journalism school, we saw, we recently have a partnership that is with the Daily Iowan. The Student Publications Inc. has purchased 2 local newspapers, and Solon and Mount Vernon, 2 weekly papers that will, retain the staff that have been there and are, experts in the community, but will start to involve more student journalists. And that idea that, this was a partnership that was sought out by the owner of those 2 papers, that people are seeing capacity within the university in a way to sustain some of these endeavors that are really, really crucial to the life of the community. And Iowa actually has a pretty healthy, compared to other states, community news ecosystem. So it's really exciting to think about how our students' learning can take place and within these communities where there are these healthy, long-term community papers already. So the shape that's going to take specifically has, I think it's good. It hasn't been determined yet, because it should be a slow process of building a relationship there and figuring out where students' help is most needed. But it is an exciting possibility that just emerged recently.
Okay, I think you've all touched on how equity plays a role in this, but I was wondering if you could speak more directly to how equity plays a role in this collective visioning, and what is it, whose job is it to find that shared understanding and vision, and what would success for that look like?
I will say it's everyone's job. Oftentimes, and I think in the past, we would say, oh, who's the DEI coordinator? And then we would call Paula, and Paula would be responsible for educating everybody. And we learned through internal work and also just through incredible examples like Paula has given us, is that it's not her job to educate us as the DEI coordinator. It's all of our jobs to do the work, to understand how we can ensure equity for everybody. And I think we're lucky in our community that people have a general baseline understanding. We also have people that will continue to push us in our community to make sure that we're equitable. And they're challenging us at all times to really make sure that we're taking equity into perspective in all aspects of community life. We won't make Paula answer next.
I was like, guys, please.
I mean, I think that's also an important part of the process of the University of Iowa being involved in this work is our students and our faculty, but especially our students, recognizing how you actually make change in this way. There's a lot of conversations that have been going on our campus right now. I'm sure everybody knows about, has heard the news around the DEI activities at the university and actually all 3 Regents institutions. But I think one of the things that's in some ways is optimistic and provides us a path forward is to look at some of the DEI work that's happening through, for example, the Better Together 2030 efforts, because it is a much more collective process that is saying, no, this is not just the responsibility of one person or one office, but we all need to lean into this. And I think that is emblematic of the entire collective impact process, is that this can't be the responsibility of only one person. This can't be the responsibility of one organization. And the truth is that this is a great example too, where we're going to have differences of opinion. And we've seen this within our community just over the last couple of months around issues. And so the important thing is for us to be able to lean in to difficult conversations, but have those conversations and do it in a way in which the voices that may not have always been heard are at the table so that we know how we continue to make progress. And that's great for our students to be able to see.
I think, yeah, I completely agree with a lot of what you said. And I think what is so interesting is one of my favorite, walk away points when I give talks or presentations about kind of equity in our community, is that everyone has to look around and see who is in their circle of trust and why, and then step out of that circle of trust. Because in the circle of trust, there is so much bias, confirmation bias, right? You surround yourself with people that you trust. And unfortunately, that trust often looks like people that look like you, that think like you. And so there is so much that comes from divergent thinking, and the reality that having equity in our community is going to be an uncomfortable process. The people that are unaccustomed to feeling uncomfortable are going to feel uncomfortable, and that has to be okay. Because the reality for many of our community members is that is their everyday life. And so they live and walk through that. And if we want to build a community that is good for us all, that allows us to pick a community where we want to be, where we want to raise children or pets or grow garden or whatever it is that you want to do in our community, it takes all of us, and it takes being in those uncomfortable spaces, having those really hard conversations, and really moving away from this idea of, I need to go find the one non-white person in the room, or the one person that is a part of the LGBTQ community, or someone that has been tokenized, and say, hey, can you tell me how I should be perhaps a better person? And say, ooh, let me do a little bit of internal figuring out. And I'm not saying that those conversations aren't important. I still get asked all the time, where are you really from? And I'm like, well, if you really want to know, I was born actually at UIHC, don't know what room, but it was somewhere in that old building. But it's the reality of, I want to have those conversations with you as that tokenized person, but that means that you also have to do a lot of work before you walk into that conversation with me, because it is not my job or our jobs as those underestimated communities to teach you how to be more equitable. It is our job to walk alongside you and have you push us from behind and have us be a part of leading where we want to go. So that's where I will close that out.
I think, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of, I've actually seen in public meetings where county and city staff will say, oh, I think that's the DEI coordinator's job. So I think we also still have to hold our leaders accountable to the things they're saying to all of us in the community, because when you watch how they do business, they aren't necessarily holding that, they aren't holding themselves accountable to that, and they're still delegating that work to the people with those titles.
Can I add one thing briefly? Yeah, I mean, looking at 2030, I mean, we can imagine the legislative environment in 2030, and that, it's not a set thing, right? And so there's maybe a trajectory, but it's not determined, it's not deterministic. So making sure to keep that sense of momentum, but also not to have, I mean, something, speaking from the university's perspective, that whatever real legislative pressures there might be, is also not an excuse to continue or to improve or enhance or further commit to values-based work. I mean, that's not, not prohibited and won't be prohibited by whatever legislation is eventually passed. So I think that's something that I think needs to be called out, and that there can't be a sense of backing down just because there's pressures to prohibit certain language, certain terms, certain activities. I mean, there's still plenty of work to do that can still be done. So, yeah.
Okay, well then, in looking to the future, how can we think about the future of nonprofit work and leadership as a way to buy into the shared vision of community?
Well, I would recommend each of you speak with Emily and Ellie and our friends from the Coralville Community Food Pantry, because United Way and the Community Foundation are leading that work every day in our community. And they have done internal work themselves to make sure that they're prioritizing the principles of representative leadership and collaboration. And they've committed to doing things differently than we've done in previous years. And so if you have a perception of the United Way or Community Foundation of years past, I would challenge you to look again, because the leadership and the teams that are developed there are really pushing nonprofits to do work differently, and also pushing funders to fund the work differently.
I think something that we see a lot in the workforce, especially that like incoming or entering workforce, is finding organizations and work that aligns with your values. I myself, I think, have a hard time seeing myself working for an organization where the values that I have as a human being and the values that I want to see in my community aren't aligning. And so I think something that is so interesting about this setup of Better Together, being a partner with the community, being a partner with the university, is how do we really show students that there are non-traditional career paths to finding work in nonprofits that is fulfilling, and hopefully someday it will be very well remunerated, yes. But that there are opportunities for that there are nonprofits doing amazing work that align with those values, that allow you to move communities in ways that make sense, and it isn't just always focused in on I'm going to start here and then I'm going to go there and then I'm going to become a lawyer, or I'm going to go here and then I'm going to go there and then I'm going to be a doctor. But all of those things, all of those careers happen in communities. They happen outside of the four walls of a classroom. And so I think what's interesting about our particular community is the work that nonprofits are doing to really open the door for students to explore career paths that align with those values and that hopefully move community in the right direction. I was one of those people. I was supposed to go to medical school and ended up falling in love with nonprofit work. And so there are opportunities for that, and I think our community does an amazing job of opening those opportunities for students.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that at the University of Iowa, we feel very lucky to be a part of this community and to be a part of the nonprofit world that really is an incredible partner for us. And, you know, I would echo what Paula was saying, which is that, you know, we don't know what 2030 looks like because it's going to unfold over the next several years. We don't know what 2040 will look like. But what we do know is that giving our students, giving everybody in the community the opportunity to lean into the issues that they care about, the work that they want to do, can and does transform what that future looks like for us. And that's what's empowering about all of this. And it is incredible for us to think about, and we always talk about this from the Office of Community Engagement, you know, we have the potential to unleash 30,000 students onto the world that are knowledgeable, but also wanting to collaborate, leaning into the issues that matter. And the best way for us to train those students is to do that while they're here at the University of Iowa, to get them connected to the organizations that are already doing that work. And when we do that, then you have people like Paula who plan to go to medical school and are now doing this incredible work. Not that you wouldn't do incredible work as a doctor too.
Thank you, thank you.
And maybe sometimes it goes the opposite, right? Maybe you decide to go to med school. But that's the power of this work. That's the power of the change that can happen, is when we see this real collaboration that happens at a very, very individual level. We always say partnerships are people. And it's really about the relationships that are formed. And so, you know, we are so lucky to be a part of a community that really embraces that.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, our students are really understandably focused on professional goals, but I think encouraging them to have more curiosity and to show up with less of an agenda, and just to be part of work that's already taking place, to witness it and to listen, is also something really important that we can encourage them to do, and all of us to do.
Okay, so then my last question to you all was just, how can we work better together, or together better is what I mean with it.
I'll go last.
I can start, and I'll actually use an example. So I actually took a class, a life-changing class with Professor Young. I will always tell her that. And then I got to, oh good. And then working at the food pantry, actually got to collaborate with her in a service learning project. And what I think was so interesting about that opportunity was, yes, students came in and did work, and you kind of see it all. You know, some students love the project and the work and coming in, and some students are like, I'm here to do the thing and get my points, and I'm going to get out. But from the nonprofit perspective, I think when you start thinking about collaborating with academic spaces, it can feel overwhelming at the thought of like, what does it take to collaborate? And what does that mean? And I think something that I would say would make us move forward or in some sort of direction, I guess, in a better way, is really having grace for each other when it comes to those things, and have a willingness to walk in with that curiosity, and to building that trust, which I think Better Together has really worked towards building that, and I think we'll always continue to try to build that trust in our community as we all learn to partner. But I think that willingness to be vulnerable, I think, is going to be the biggest piece of moving forward with trust.
I would say, too, that I think leaning into and committing to the idea that it takes time to build relationships, and to recognize that that in and of itself is a goal and objective of this work, is so important. Because, you know, Katie was talking at the very beginning about sort of how we got to where we are today. And that a lot of that had to do with trust building that happened prior to the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic and during the 2020 social unrest that happened. We were required to work better together during that year. We had to, in order to get the things done we needed to. And I think that required us to spend time with one another. Now that was virtual, but that required us to spend time together, to talk to one another. And I think we can't jump to the future we want without committing to the day in and day out relationship building that it takes, so that we can have hard conversations, so that we can bring people to the table that aren't there. That in and of itself is part of the process, and we have to commit to that. And it's not always easy to do, because we're so focused on what is the deliverable. We're so focused on what we want to see happen, but we've got to also focus on how do we get there? What's the process look like?
Well, I think the way that I would say it is, a growth mindset is probably the most important, that we have to be willing to make mistakes and try again and give each other grace, like Paula said. But Jenny Banta, the director of the United Way, said to me once that for her, this is about radical candor. And that means caring so much about the person or the community that you care enough to be honest and have a tough conversation. And I think that has stuck with me a lot, and you come at it from a place of deep care, and you understand, and you know and you trust their intent. And if we can do that, I think we will continue to be better together.
Okay. All right, well, can we give our panelists a round of applause? And now I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, but if you would just raise your hand and then wait for me to come around with the mic to say your question into the mic for us all. So hold on a second, though. It's not, okay. All right. Okay.
Hello. My name is Anthony Houghton. I think I've gotten a chance to meet almost all of you at some point. I'm really fortunate because I get to sit sort of at the intersection of working in nonprofits, but also I serve as an adjunct professor for the university, so I get to see a little bit of both sides. And I see the work that practitioners like Katie and Rachel and other folks like David Gould and Travis Krause are doing to sort of teach like right at the intersection of the community and the university. But as a professor, sometimes I feel kind of lost about like, how do I get started getting my students like in the community? Do you guys have any recommendations for like how I could do that as a professor?
Well, I would say, can I ask like what your class is and what experience you'd be looking for your students so I can be more specific?
Yeah, so I teach a first-year seminar for
awesome.
New students. We call it Thriving at Iowa, Finding Success as Black Men, so it's really centered around elevating retention rates and graduation rates specifically for Black men. But I think that I'd like to see ultimately like maybe a toolkit or pathways where other professors could also do this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think thinking about students at that level in their first year, many of whom aren't from here, by the time I would get students a few years down the road, they still might not know very much at all about the community. I mean, to them, the community that they're part of or comfortable in is fairly constrained if they're not from Iowa City and don't have those connections. So I think the simple step of opening the doors to show them what's in the community already, what organizations are working, where they might want to volunteer their time, where they might, the mission might connect to something they're interested in. I think that's actually really crucial and important first step, because again, by the time I might have students as juniors, they don't know those things yet. So if we're talking about like sort of capacity and community engagement building across the students' time at the university, just developing that sense that the county, the city is way beyond just the campus. I think it sounds like kind of simple, but I think it's really crucial, and I think can also, help develop a sense of place and belonging for the students as well, as like connecting them to something they might eventually end up really caring about. But happy to talk more.
Yeah, I would say too, just, I think one of the things we have to remember is that it's okay for us not to jump from 0 to 60. And so my office, and Jan Warren is sitting right here. She's in our office. She teaches actually a first-year seminar on community engagement. And even in that seminar, that's all about community engagement. Our students are not out doing huge projects with community partners, delivering major reports. It's about getting them exposed to the organizations, how our community works, who are the major players. What does it mean to walk 15 minutes east of campus? Who do you run into? What organizations do you have? And so just to echo what Rachel was saying, I think it's okay to step the process. And if you're teaching a first-year seminar, start just with the very idea of getting them connected to people. And then it can build from there.
I'm not a professor, so take this with a grain of salt. But I really actually like the idea of having students explore their own lived experiences and how they find their own values and things that they want to pursue. Because I think personally what has happened is my lived experiences have really driven me to want to work with immigrant communities, because I am the child of an immigrant and I always will be, and my children will also always be children of an immigrant family. And so that has driven my particular value and passion. And as many as nonprofits as there are in the area, I'm just naturally going to feel more connected to some of them because of that value alignment. And so having or giving students that space to work through their lived experiences, understand where their values lie, I think is going to lead into those spaces of getting them connected, and knowing that they might walk away from your first year seminar and maybe not be connected to a particular organization, but at least have an understanding of what they want to see in the community, or a community that they might feel more connected to. I think in the long term, when we start thinking or looking at long-term impact in communities, I think that is going to be very impactful when they are able to walk into those spaces. One, because they have a connection, right? But also that they feel like they bring something to the table, that their lived experiences are assets that they can now leverage in community work, in that nonprofit, into walking into that space and saying oh, this is a lived experience I have. Maybe I have a little bit more knowledge than the people in this space, and I see how I could build a program out with that, or how I can, collaborate to do something bigger. So those are my 2 cents.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys.
Thank y'all so much for the great panel. I just can't help but pitch an event and then ask a question. And the event is that on April 11th, the Obermann Center is bringing Leslie Ann Noel to town to do several things, but she has a new book. Her area is design thinking and designing projects with a lens on equity. And she's just published a book. She has a book on Black design, and she's just published another book that's about building equity into the design project process when you set up projects. And she'll be at Prairie Lights at 7 on April 11th, and we're giving away free books for her book. So we hope y'all come. The other thing I wanted to ask was, whenever I've served on boards or worked with community organizations, I've been so struck that in the business community in Iowa City, if you are a staff member, especially at a higher level in the bank or whatever, you're expected to serve on a community board or two. That's part of your career. And I've often wondered what it would take to make that a value at the university for our faculty and our administrators. And I wonder if you all know of places where that is a value, and if you have thoughts about what that would take in line with the great work you're doing.
I mean, yes, there are places where that is more of a value than here. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, Teresa, is that I think that speaks to a broader effort that we have to make to make us recognize that as researchers, as faculty, as staff at the University of Iowa, we are also members of this community. We're impacted by the nonprofit organizations that work here. We're impacted by the businesses that serve us. We're impacted by the healthcare organizations that we visit when we get sick. And I'm struck because I was in a conversation the other day where somebody was telling me that sometimes it's hard for them as a faculty member to think of themselves as anything other than this researcher that's focused on a very narrow issue, which is oftentimes how we come up as researchers, how we are trained in doctoral programs. And yet, when we step back a little bit and think about everything that we're doing in our work and the things that we care about, there's so many opportunities for us to be connected to nonprofits. So I think part of it is just encouragement and really sort of the multiplier effect, the idea that the more of us that do this, the more collaboration that's out there, the more that we hear it. I will also say this. Statistics show that junior faculty are overwhelmingly more interested in being a part of community organizations than faculty of 30 or 40 years ago. I think the tide is just changing, and it will continue to change. And Rachel can probably speak better to that because I don't know what your thoughts are on that. But
I would just say, it's not a surprise that people orient their work toward what's rewarded often and what's expected. And so we have, our definitions of how faculty in particular are rewarded relate to the impact of their work. But there's a real explicit sometimes definition of impact. It's not local impact. It's, impact within a scholarly field. So I think that if we want to encourage our faculty to do meaningful community work as part of their appointments at the university, it can't be something extra that they do because it's a personal passion, which I do think we see a lot. I think personally, I think it will have to be something if we want to expand the quality and quantity of this work. And you don't want to just expand the quantity, it has to be, again, meaningful, community engaged work that really comes out of relationships and trust and understanding of community needs. Then, the language and the incentive structure, I think will have to change. And there are a lot of institutions where that has changed, or where there are options at our neighbor University of Illinois, for instance. There's track in the tenure and promotion process for public engagement. So you can decide that that's the focus of your work. You'll be reviewed, by people who have expertise in community engagement, maybe by, people within the community who don't have a PhD after their name. So there are examples of how structures at the university can shift to encourage and reward that type of work. I think that's, a goal.
Well, and to be fair too, the incentive is really important, and a bank isn't doing it necessarily because it's selfless, but in fact, it's required too of the Community Reinvestment Act as part of federal law for them to give back to their communities in which they're located. And so building in that incentive, I think, would almost immediately have a big impact, at least in promotion and tenure. I think the other part is the board service. is the fundraising. So we have really high percentage of pretty high salaries in our community, and much of that money goes directly back into the university through the Center for Advancement, which is such an important player, and they do a really important work. But that does dry up a pretty significant source of fundraising for local nonprofits that's immediately spoken for. And so if you're associated with the university or have community and family members who are, making sure you're also thinking about giving to local nonprofits and not necessarily back to the institution itself.
And I think speaking of systems that already exist, it's a really great opportunity to also call in nonprofits into the structures that we've built as nonprofits for what is an expectation for someone on the board. And I think that in itself also creates this dissonance, especially with faculty of color who often aren't given the opportunity, one, because the structure doesn't ask them to, and two, because perhaps their income is not at a level that they would think that they should fit into a nonprofit board. And so I think what's interesting about our community is there are a number of nonprofits who are reevaluating the values that they hope their board members align with and what they really ask of board members and the impact of fundraising, but also the impact that they may have in other community engagement aspects of being a board member of those places. So it's definitely a two-way street.
It's interesting, too, because I'm thinking back to a conversation that I was having a couple of years ago with a leadership group at the university and a very high, not very high, fairly high senior level administrator at the university had never really been on a board before. And they raised their hand and asked me, so how do I become the board of director at an organization? And I said, well, actually, the first thing you might want to consider doing is volunteering. Is thinking about what kinds of organizations align with what you are wanting to give your time to, and how can you spend your time working for that organization as a volunteer. And I think that culture, whether it's a high-level administrator or whether it's a faculty member or whether it's really anybody at the institution, encouraging that culture, that's a valuable way for us to be an organization, and the values that we want our employees to have, I think is important. And then what Paul is saying is really important, because I think that there is this expectation that it's going to be the vice president of the university that's on the board. But what about the faculty members or anybody else? And that is changing. We are seeing that with nonprofits across our community.
Okay, so if we have one more question, I think that's what we have time for. If anyone else has a question. Okay, and if we don't, then we can just give our panelists another round of applause. Thank you all so much for coming out, and please chat with the community organizations in the back if you have time.